All right, hi everybody. This is my first attempt to record one of these for Bio 112. I tried my best to get some awesome animated GIFs and stuff in here for you, but I kept crashing my presentation software, so that wasn't working. But maybe I will try to figure a way around that and make it a little better for next week. All right, so here we go. Exercise 17 is about the deuterostomes. Like everything we've looked at so far this semester, deuterostomes are members of the kingdom Animalia. There are two phyla that we are going to be examining, the Echinodermata and the Chordata. What they have in common compared to the protostomes, which we've looked at before now, is that in the deuterostomes, the first opening that forms in the blastula during embryonic development becomes the anus, and the second opening becomes the mouth. In the organisms we've looked at before, which were all protostomes, the mouth developed from the first opening in the blastula. So the first part of this lab talks about the development of deuterostome embryos. A lot of deuterostomes have their embryos develop inside of a body, like in people, or inside of an egg where you can't really see what's going on. So a lot of the research that's been done on embryonic development has been done in sea urchins. So those are the examples on your worksheet. Those are the examples in your book, and that's what's shown on these slides as well. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see an unfertilized egg. Okay, that's the before. When these eggs come in contact with sperm, only one of them can actually fertilize the egg. As soon as a sperm penetrates the membrane of the egg, a fertilization envelope forms, which you can see in the after picture. After fertilization, the embryo undergoes what's called cleavage, when one cell divides into two, and then two into four, and then four into eight, and so on, to create what's called a morula, or just a undifferentiated, unshaped clump of cells. You can see that process happening in the embryo on the right hand side here, and all of those images are to the same scale. Okay, that should help you answer one of your questions. Okay, after the embryo has reached the morula stage, it develops into what's called a blastula. And the blastula is basically a hollow ball made of cells. The center of that ball is hollow, called the blastocele. Okay, and the cells around it are not equal in size. And what's going to happen is there's an area of this blastula that has larger cells, and that's called the vegetal plate. And at some point, once the blastula is large enough, it undergoes a process called gastrulation. And during gastrulation, the larger cells in the vegetal plate divide and start to move into the blastocele. Okay, so it basically pushes its way in, as you can see on the right hand side there. And the first opening where the vegetal plate pushes in during gastrulation is called the blastopore. And again, these are deuterostome organisms we're talking about, so that blastopore is going to end up becoming the anus. Okay, at the very top of where the vegetal plate is pushing its way in, mesoderm is starting to be formed. Mesoderm is eventually going to line the sort of inside parts of what was the blastocele. The vegetal plate is going to become the endoderm, and all the other parts of the blastula become the ectoderm. Okay, eventually it's going to push all the way through during gastrulation, and there's a continuous tube through the middle of the embryo. And the second hole that forms is going to eventually develop into the mouth. All right, so one of the two phyla we're going to look at tonight is the echinoderms. What all the different echinoderms have in common is that they have what's called pentaradial symmetry. So they are radially symmetric, and they have the number of sort of segments they have around the center is always a multiple of 5, or almost always a multiple of 5. It's really obvious in things like sea stars. It's less obvious in things like sea slugs. They also have a dermal skeleton, which means it kind of grows out of their skin, made of what are called ossicles. And attached to those ossicles are spines, and that's where the name of the phylum comes from. Echinodermata means spiny skin. Another thing that they have in common with each other, and that isn't found in any other living thing on the planet, is what's called a water vascular system. The most interesting part of that water vascular system is the tube feet. Okay, so you can see them in the picture on the top. They're coming out of that sea star's arm, and you can see that they have kind of like little suction cup shapes on the bottom. So different kinds of echinoderms use their tube feet for different things, but in general they're used for feeding and movement. Okay, sometimes just for attachment as well. They're an extension of this internal system that actually can draw seawater in from the outside world and basically use it as hydraulic fluid. Okay, they extend through the endoskeleton, through pores, and they use this hydraulic pressure to change size and shape of the individual tube feet. And we'll see more of that later when we do the internal anatomy. Okay. Some of them are very small and numerous, like in the sea star. And sometimes they are smaller in number but larger in size. The thing on the bottom there is called a sea pig. It's a type of deep sea cucumber. And you can see it's actually walking up on its tube feet, the ones sort of on the side to the left. All right, so next we're going to talk about various classes of echinoderms. The first one is the class Crinoidea. Okay, these are what's called sea lilies and feather stars. They got the name sea lilies because a lot of them, like the one on the bottom right, are attached and they kind of look like flowers. These were some of the earliest echinoderms that we have in the fossil record. At times, they were incredibly abundant on the planet. They're kind of like an upside down sea star. So when we talk about sea stars and all echinoderms, actually, other than the sea cucumbers, they have what's called an oral surface where the mouth is, and an aboral surface, right, or the one that's on the opposite of the mouth. So in the crinoids that are attached, they're kind of like an upside down sea star because their stalk is attached to the aboral surface and their mouth is pointing out towards the ocean. Okay. If they have a stalk, and not all of them do, the photo on the left is of what's called a feather star. That's an unattached crinoid. That's basically just free swimming around in the ocean. But if they do have a stalk by which they attach, then they don't move around very much at all. And all of their important organs and bodily systems are up in the flower-looking part of the organism. So they don't use tube feet for movement, but they do have tube feet on their feathers, or what look like petals, right? What are called pinnacles. And they use them for filter feeding to help grab particles of food and move them into the mouth, which again is in the center. Okay. A slightly more familiar class is the Ophiuroidea. We call these brittle stars. They look kind of like real sea stars, but not exactly. Okay, again, they have an oral surface where the mouth is, and like sea stars, their oral surface points towards the substrate, which means the ground. Okay, but unlike sea stars, their legs are of consistent width. It's really clear where they attach to the central disc. Okay, because right, it's just really obvious because having a consistent width to those legs makes it easy to see where the leg stops and the central disc starts. Those legs are jointed, which makes them much more flexible than in a typical sea star. And they do have tube feet that they use to attach to things, but they don't really use them for movement. You can see in that picture on the top left, they generally move by bending their legs and changing the shape of their legs. The next class is Echinoidea. These are the sea urchins and sand dollars. Okay, sand dollars are basically really flat urchins. Probably when you think of a sea urchin, you think of the thing on the left, which are more ball shaped and really, really spiny. But sand dollars are part of this group too, and they're just much flatter, and their spines are not very prominent at all. The big difference is that typical urchins are going to walk around up on top of the substrate, and their oral surface is toward the substrate, just like in the brittle stars. But sand dollars generally are going to bury themselves within the substrate. Okay. They have a very solid endoskeleton. It's left behind after they die and the soft tissues decay. That's what you find on the beach as a sand dollar. It's the endoskeleton of one of these echinoids. As I mentioned, some of them have very prominent spikes. They do have tube feet that actually extend through their endoskeleton on all surfaces of the body, although the ones pointed on the sort of oral surface towards the substrate are going to be the ones that they actually use for movement. Most of them have some sort of scraping mouth parts that they use to attack other organisms or just scrape algae off of rocks and things like that. A less familiar class is going to be the Holothuriidea. These are the sea cucumbers and sea pigs. So on the right hand side here, the picture on the top, we've seen that already. That is a sea pig. On the right hand side of that picture is where its mouth is going to be, and so that is the oral end of this organism. And the things on the right hand side are not actually tube feet. They're modified from tube feet, but they're called tentacles. Okay, and then the sea cucumber on the bottom is more typical. The sea pig on the top, along its sides, has, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4 in the picture, large tube feet that it uses to lift itself up off the substrate and walk around. The sea cucumber on the bottom has many tiny tube feet. You can't really see them in this picture at all, but on the surface that is pointed towards the substrate, it's being held up just barely off that surface by all these tiny tube feet that it can use to move around. It doesn't have an oral and aboral side really, but it has a mouth at one end and an anus at the other end. And the tentacles around the mouth, like I mentioned, are modified tube feet. In the picture on the top left, you can kind of see them working. They extend out and capture tiny particles of food. And the tentacle in the top right corner of that picture is actually folded into the mouth, which is the middle. They basically grab stuff and then they shove the tentacle into their mouth and I guess kind of suck off any food that was attached to it. Okay, so basically they are filter feeders, either just pulling from the water column or pulling out of the substrate. The most familiar class for most of you, I'm guessing, is Asteroidea, which is the sea stars or starfish. Like the brittle stars, their oral surface points towards the substrate, and their endoskeleton is flexible, but it's not jointed in the way that a brittle star's is. Also, their arms are thicker near the central disc, which makes it less easy to tell where the arm ends and the disc begins. Okay, that's a major difference between Asteroidea and the brittle stars. Okay. Also, unlike brittle stars, they move using their tube feet. Okay, so they have many, many tube feet on the oral side. Um, and you can see that in the picture on the top right. The arms aren't actually touching the sand there. That's a sea star that got left up on the beach when the tide went out. Okay, so the arms aren't actually touching the sand, but all those little tube feet coming out of the arms are. They also use their tube feet for feeding. The picture on the bottom right is a sea star that has wrapped itself around a clam. So even though individual tube feet are quite small, when you have a lot of them working together, it can exert very, very strong forces. If you remember from a few slides ago, they can change the shape of these tube feet, and they can make it so that these tube feet have basically like a suction cup on the end of them. And using all their arms together and using lots of tube feet from each arm, they can actually force open the shells of things like clams. Okay, so in that picture on the bottom right, the mouth is actually on the underside of the sea star at the top of its body there. Okay, and then the arms are wrapped around a clam. So what happens is they force open that clam, and it doesn't have to be a lot, but once they force that clam open just enough, the sea star can actually evert its stomach, which basically means its stomach turns inside out as it comes out of its body, and it goes into the shell of the clam and starts digesting the clam within its own shell. Okay, so I wouldn't want to go that way, but that's how they work. Okay. All right, so the next slide is showing the internal anatomy of one of these sea stars. So this is an example of class Asteroidea. The only real parts that you need to understand and pay attention to are the ones in the red boxes. As I mentioned, like all echinoderms, they do have spines. In sea stars, those spines are generally pretty blunt and short. At the end of each arm, they have an eye spot, which is connected to a nervous system. They do have a ring nerve in the central disc, okay, and there are nerves that run down each arm. But the part you want to focus on here is the water vascular system. In this image, it's shown as that sort of like aqua blue stuff. Okay, there is a ring in the central disc that connects it all together. On the aboral side of the central disc, there's going to be something called the madreporite. Sometimes it's called like a sieve pore, I think. That is where they can take seawater into their water vascular system and get rid of it too, I guess. Okay, because every other part of the water vascular system is sealed. It has to be in order to create hydraulic pressure. Okay, so you can see from that central ring called the central canal, there are radial canals that run the length of each arm. And coming off of those radial canals are the tube feet. Okay, at the top of every tube foot is a little balloon basically called an ampulla. And the ampulla holds fluid until it's needed. And basically, in order to extend a particular tube foot, the ampulla attached to that tube foot has to squeeze. And when it squeezes, the fluid, the water, the seawater in this system gets pushed into the tube foot, and that tube foot extends. Okay, and then they're capable of manipulating how much water is in each particular tube foot, and with muscles they can change the orientation of the various tube feet in order to attach to things and move in specific directions and do all kinds of interesting things. Right? We don't have anything like this in our anatomy. All right, the next section of this lab is about the phylum Chordata. All of the classes within the phylum Chordata share a few things in common. Okay, they all have a notochord for at least part of their life. And what a notochord is a flexible rod of cartilage, okay, that runs along sort of the dorsal side of the organism. Okay, again, at some point in their life, they all have what are called pharyngeal gill slits. They're not always actually associated with gills the way we think of gills in a fish, right? If you remember how we've used the word pharynx before, which is what pharyngeal refers to, it usually has something to do with the throat area between the mouth and the stomach, or the mouth and the esophagus. Okay, all chordates also have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. Okay, and unlike some of the organisms we looked at before, chordates that have a tail have their tail after their anus. Okay, if you remember when we looked at the crayfish, the anus was right at the end of the organism, right? Whether there was a tail there or not. Okay, but for chordates, the anus comes before what we would call a tail. So there are 3 classes that we need to talk about. 2 of them we're only going to talk about tonight, and then the vertebrates, which are animals with backbones like us. We're going to talk about them again over the next 2 weeks. So the first class that we're going to talk about tonight is Cephalochordata. The common name for these organisms is the lancelets. You can find them in sort of temperate and tropical oceans, marine waters, salt water all over the world. They're pretty small. They're all less than 10 centimeters, right? So no more than 3 or 4 inches long. They bury themselves in the sand, basically sticking their head up out of the sand, and they are filter feeders, pulling tiny things from the water to feed on. Because they're so small and thin, they don't really have a respiratory system. They have a very reduced circulatory system, but what they do have in common with us are all the vertebrate characteristics. Okay? All the chordate characteristics. And the images at the top, the one on the left is a reconstruction of an extinct organism called Pikaia. And the one on the right is a fossil of an organism called Mylocunmingia. We think that these are our earliest chordate relatives that ever existed on the planet. And then the picture in the bottom left is a living lancelet as they exist in the world today. So let's look at the anatomy of a living lancelet a little closer. All right, so you can see they have a head end, right, anterior, and they have a posterior tail end. They also have a dorsal side and a ventral side. Okay, so in the dorsal side of the organism, they have that flexible cartilage notochord. Okay, and it supports a dorsal nerve cord, which is on top of that. Okay, dorsal to the nerve cord, they have a dorsal fin that helps them swim. At the posterior end, they have a caudal fin. Okay, and again, it's important to note that the caudal fin is more posterior than the anus. Okay, at the anterior end, they don't really have a brain. It's not much, right? They are cephalized, right, which means they have a head end, but the structures that are there are not all that well developed. Okay, I mentioned that they are filter feeders, and the way this works is they suck in seawater through the mouth, and then it enters the pharynx. And the pharynx is not a solid sac. Okay, so you can see on this it's labeled gill slits. And what happens is water passes through that pharynx. Small items of food get trapped and moved with mucus into the digestive tract. And then the seawater moves through the gill slits out into the body cavity, the coelom. Okay, and so that water actually gets expelled through what's called the atrial pore, while anything worth eating moves into the digestive tract, and the waste from the digestion gets expelled through the anus. Okay, so it's not exactly how a fish does it because they only have one opening for water to go in and one opening for water to go out. Okay, but um, they are still filtering food using those gill slits. You just can't see the gill slits. You can't see evidence of them from the outside. If you were to take a cross section of one of these organisms, you can see that they have a lot of muscle, right? That's the feathery looking pink stuff on the top. And then they have sort of a big open cavity towards the bottom. That open cavity is the coelom. And whenever you see that open cavity, you can tell that that is the ventral side of the organism. Okay, so the side with all the muscle is the dorsal side. On the ventral side, you can see two sort of dark purple objects. Those are the gonads. Okay, the gonads are always paired. Above the gonad on the right is another little object. That is the liver. Okay, so within the coelom, all those little bars, those are the parts of the pharynx that support the gill slits. Sorry, I'm making sure I know what your book calls them. Right, so the gill slits are the openings between those bars. I'm trying to look up again, make sure I use the right word. I don't really see one in here. All right, so all those little purple pieces in like a row there, those are the pharynx, right? But again, remember the pharynx at this point in the organism is not solid. Okay, so the openings between those are the gill slits. Okay, and just above the coelom, you can see that oval purple, or sorry, like pinkish and white thing. That is the notochord. And then the lighter colored one right sitting on top of it is the dorsal nerve cord. Okay, so from the bottom to the top, the two purple things are gonads, right? They surround the pharynx. To the right of the pharynx is the liver. Directly above the pharynx is the notochord. Directly above that is the dorsal nerve cord. And then surrounding the whole dorsal side is muscle. Okay. The other chordate class that we're really only going to hear about tonight is Hemichordata. These are the tunicates. These are strange organisms because if you saw one, you might think that they were just a sponge or something like that. But they're actually are the closest living relative of all organisms with a backbone. Okay, which is a little strange because they are sessile, right? Most of them are going to stick to one place for their entire life. Some of them do drift through the ocean and they can form really, really large colonies. And that's what you see in the picture on the right there. The ones that do that are called salps. And some of them form colonies that are actually as big as some of the largest whales, or as long as, I should say. They don't have nearly as much mass. They get their name from like a protective layer called the tunic, which strangely for an animal is actually made out of cellulose, right? That's what we normally associate with the cell walls of plants. I actually ate one of these once when I was in Tokyo. I worked there for a few months and the professor took us all out for sushi, and I didn't really realize that it was a dare and they wanted to see my reaction, but they ordered one of these for me and it was not awesome. They're all filter feeders. They basically work the same way that a lancelet does. They take in seawater through a mouth. It passes through a pharynx, which has a bunch of slits in it. The pharynx traps food particles that move into the digestive system, while the filtered seawater then gets pushed back out through another hole. Okay, so they don't seem like they have all that much in common with us as adults. and they really don't. Okay, in terms of their overall shape. So you can see, though, this slide shows an adult on the left and a larva on the right. And the larva actually has way more in common with us than the adult seems to. So when they are first developing as larvae, they do have a notochord. They have a postanal tail. They have a dorsal nerve cord. Okay, they have all these things that a lancelet also has, that you also have. Okay, but at some point, the red arrow there shows the point at which the sessile ones are going to attach to some kind of solid object. And when they do that and develop into the adult, they lose the notochord, they lose the dorsal nerve cord, they lose the tail, and basically develop into that sponge-looking creature that we call the adult tunicate. All right, the last class that we're going to talk about today, but again, we're just really touching the surface today, and we're going to talk more about it in the next few exercises, is the vertebrates. Class Vertebrata. Okay, all vertebrates have an endoskeleton. That means a skeleton on the inside. They all start out as cartilage. Some vertebrates have a endoskeleton that then develops into bone later on. Okay, whether it stays as cartilage or develops into bone, all vertebrates have what's called a cranium, right? What we think of as our skull. And they all have a vertebral column, which is what the notochord has developed into in the vertebrates. Okay, most vertebrates also have jaws. Okay, everything from cartilaginous fishes, what we call sharks and rays, up on the phylogeny has jaws, and then everything from ray-finned fishes up has bone. So agnathans, hagfishes and lampreys don't have jaws, and cartilaginous fishes, the sharks, don't have bone. Okay, and this is the only class among all living things on Earth that can thermoregulate. Like us, not all of them can, right? But mammals like us and some birds are actually able of maintaining body temperatures above that of the surrounding air or water. Okay. The last thing to talk about tonight has to do with some bony fish anatomy. Right, and the reason we're looking at bony fish is because they have all the same basic parts that we do, right? What we call homologous structures, those structures that evolved in our common ancestor and did not actually evolve separately in both of us, right? So you look at that picture of the girl holding the perch, you might not think they have all that much in common, but in fact, they really, really do, okay? You have the same sort of basic bone structure as, you know, your pet goldfish. And there was a whole book written called Your Inner Fish, you can see it there, about all the things about the human body that are the way they are because we evolved from fish. And you have a couple questions about which fins on the fish relate to your legs and your arms. Hopefully you guys can figure that out. All right. I know this is not ideal. The next one I make will be better. Still trying to learn some new tricks. I hope everybody is doing okay. And, well, I guess I won't see you for the rest of the year. But please feel free to email me with any questions, concerns, if you just want to say hi, whatever else you need. All right. Talk to you again soon. Bye.